Recording live from the ARC studios, welcome to the Sustainability Podcast. Our goal is to provide engaging discussions on a broad range of topics regarding cybersecurity, sustainability, supply chain management, plus much more. For more information and to get into contact with us, visit us at arcweb.com.
Welcome to today's episode of the Sustainability Podcast. This is where ARC takes a deep dive into the world of sustainability and the energy transition, and we explore innovation and challenges that shape our future. I'm your host, Rick Rys. I'm the Director of Consulting at ARC, and we have a very special guest with us. Today we have Toby Ferenczi. He is the co-founder of Granular Energy, and I think also has a great involvement with another company, Energy Tag. And we'd like to welcome him to this podcast. So, Toby, tell us about yourself. How did you come to this industry, and how did you get involved with Granular Energy and Energy Tag?
Great. Hi, Rick. Thank you so much for having me on the show today. I'm delighted to be here. So I've spent the last 20 years or so in the energy industry. I'm based out of London in the UK, although as a company, Granular Energy, we are 25 people split across Europe and the United States. My background, I've studied physics in undergrad. I learned about climate change during that. I took a class on climate change and kind of realized this isn't a problem that I wanted to spend my life solving, because unfortunately it's kind of a big problem for all of us, and is not going to be an easy one to solve. So I went and did a PhD in solar energy. I spent 3 years in the lab working on kind of novel material science for solar panels. Then decided that, okay, that was enough of being in the lab. I needed to get out into industry, so I took a job with General Electric in their global research department. Spent time in New York, but also in Munich, in Germany, where they have a research facility. And that was great because, going back to 2008, 80% of the world's solar panels were installed in Germany. That was kind of the ground zero for our renewables industry. So that was fascinating. But then I kind of got the bug for entrepreneurship, and I did my first startup, which was a rooftop solar financing business with a friend from Cambridge who had been a consultant at Bain. And we sold that company back in 2013 to a Chinese solar panel manufacturer. Which was a great experience. And then I did another startup in demand response, so software to help optimize electric vehicles and batteries. And that was also a while ago. And we sold that company in 2017 to a energy supply business in Europe. And that's how I got interested in this question and the problem that Granular Energy is solving, which is this kind of fundamental question of how, as a consumer, can you actually choose one type of electricity over another? And Granular Energy is a software company providing software to utilities to help them give this choice to customers and to give customers transparency over whether they're buying renewable energy or fossil fuels. And we can talk about how we do that. And then you mentioned Energy Tag. Energy Tag is actually a non-profit. It's not a for-profit business. It's an NGO that is working to create new standards, new frameworks around energy certification. And actually, I started that prior to doing Granular Energy to try to change and get consensus around an improvement in how we certify clean energy. I'm pleased to say I no longer am active in the running of Energy Tag. It's now run by our team in Brussels. But it's certainly been an important part of the story of what we're doing, because it's we're actually trying to, as well as develop new tools and software to help improve the industry, we're also trying to change the way things are done today for the better.
Well, I can tell you that we're both on the same page with regards to our enthusiasm for managing an energy transition and getting us to a sustainable energy supply source and reducing environmental concerns. So, but one of the key things I think that we are see about granular energy, and there are a couple of terms that I would like you to kind of define for the audience. What is an EAC? I think you refer to it as an energy attribute certificate, or maybe it's also called a REC, R-E-C, Renewable Energy Credit. That's how we are using it here in the U.S. And what is also the GO term, Guarantee of Origin?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, if we just back up a second, the question that we're asking here is, as a consumer, like a lot, and we're seeing demand for this from lots of both individuals and businesses, starting, not everyone, but we're starting to see businesses express a preference for buying clean energy instead of fossil fuels. And I would say it's one of the most important consumer choices that any business or individual has, is like where your energy comes from, and because it's one of the most impactful things that we can do to help the energy transition. But in order to make that choice, you need a reliable mechanism to account for the clean energy that's on the system. Because if you think about it, there's like, all the power stations, all the renewable plants and coal power stations are all connected to the same electric grid, right? So you can't physically tell whether the, power that's, charging your laptop right now has come from a solar farm or a coal power station. So how does it work? The answer is these terms that you just mentioned, and EAC is the generic term for an energy certificate, energy attribute certificate. RECs are just one subset of that they're referred to in the US and some other countries, referring to a renewable energy credit. So there's just one type of EAC. Similarly, GOs, guarantees of origin, that's the term used in Europe for EACs. But ultimately, they're the same instrument, and they work pretty much the same wherever you go in the world. And the way they work is actually really simple. Every unit of energy that is generated by a solar farm gets a digital tag, essentially, a certificate, that is then stored on a central registry, or often called a tracking system, which is run by an ISO or regulator. And then consumers can go buy these credits, or energy utilities on behalf of their consumers can buy them, and match that 1 megawatt hour of generation with a megawatt hour of consumption. So you can reliably claim that for that megawatt hour, your energy has come from that particular source, and therefore claim the carbon emissions associated with that source. So they form this really important accounting system, and that's really what we're talking about. Our software is a software solution to manage these EACs, and there's a big change happening to how these REC systems work. They were introduced about 20 years ago, and they haven't really been updated. And so, if you want, I'd be happy to tell you about some of the changes and the dynamics that are happening.
All right, so we'll get to that, I think. But one of the so basically, what you're talking about is that there is a decoupling from the power purchase agreement, where you're selling megawatt hours of power. So, for example, a power purchasing agreement from our 2 wind turbines in our town, we are selling that power to other entities, and they would purchase a percentage of that power as it's generated. All right, and so because it's purchased as it's generated, they can't really. They cannot purchase power 24/7 because it doesn't generate 24/7. But they could accumulate the renewable energy credits or the energy attributes, and and somehow they could claim, let's say, that they could be 100% renewable if they just buy these RECs when it is in fact windy, because the RECs are accumulated when it's at a higher rate when it's windy, or a higher rate for solar RECs when it's sunny. So can you describe that? That's done on I think today, on an annular basis, not an hourly basis.
Quite, yeah, exactly. So let's unpack that a little bit. So you're absolutely right. Right now we have kind of two separate mechanisms for matching supply and demand of electricity. You have something called the wholesale electricity market, which is a system generally overseen by ISOs to coordinate producers and consumers on the system to match supply and demand in typically 1 hour or 30-minute windows, sometimes less than that, to help keep the grid in balance, right? We all know, like, to keep the lights on, the grid needs to be perfectly in balance at all times. And that's why we have these power markets, which are an hourly or half-hourly mechanism. And we have a power price that varies throughout the day according to supply and demand. And that system is really important. And the PPA is one contract within the wholesale power market that allows people to contract over a long period of time with a particular generator. And without going into too much detail, but the challenge with the power market today is that it pulls all the power together. They're literally called pools, right? New England pool, like this. And the way they work is because all that power is pooled together, you don't know what you bought when you go to the power market. There's no traceability element. And even if I have a PPA with a wind farm, that PPA is just a commercial contract. So it does not legally allow me to claim that my energy has come from that wind farm, because there's no protection against things like double counting, right? There's no accounting system to prevent that same unit of energy being claimed twice by different people. So that's why we created this separate system, which, as you pointed out today, is an annual matching system of renewable energy certificates, which forms the basis of any kind of claims or purchases of clean energy, but is flawed because it's based on an annual match of supply and demand. And what that means is, if you use 10 units of energy in a year and you buy 10 units of certificates, as long as those certificates were generated in the same 12-month window, then you can claim you're 100% renewable, right? And you can kind of see how that was okay when the system was introduced 20 years ago, because there were no renewables on the grid. So timing didn't really matter. But today, timing is everything, right? There are many times a day when we produce too much renewables on the system, and other times when we hardly have any at all. And so we need to move our certificate system to be more in line with how our electricity markets work, and base them on hourly or half-hourly matching instead of annual matching. And this is actually what this nonprofit I set up, Energy Tag, is calling for. It's the international standards body for time-stamped RECs. So RECs that come with a timestamp that enable you to pinpoint when your energy has come from a particular source. And it actually got support from Google and Microsoft. There are some big tech companies out there that want to demonstrate that their data centers are powered on clean energy 24/7. And we also got support from many utilities and the United Nations and so on, to kind of change the system. And thankfully, authorities are starting to agree with this concept. And the US Treasury, for instance, introduced a new rule for green hydrogen production. It's called the 45V guidance on the investment tax credit for the production of green hydrogen. And what it suggests is that in order to verify that the hydrogen is green, you need to show that the electrolyzer that produces the hydrogen was matched with clean energy on an hour-by-hour basis, as well as some other criteria. And that's just a sign that indicates that we need to go down to this higher level of granularity if you want to be really sure that the electricity is clean, is zero carbon. So it's all about having a new, reliable definition for what it means to be using clean energy.
So I'm the light commissioner in my small town of Princeton, Massachusetts. And Massachusetts regulations require all the municipal electric companies to be 50% non-carbon emitting portfolio by the year 2030. And substantially the way that will be measured is renewable energy credits. We have two wind turbines. Those wind turbines generate, I think, 1 renewable energy credit for every megawatt hour of power they put into the grid. So the wholesale energy market, we may get paid for that megawatt hour on a power purchase agreement, but we generate that REC. Now, our utility has chosen to sell those RECs to somebody else, so we can't technically claim that this wind is a renewable energy asset and part of our portfolio. So I think that's a very important point as we try to meet these requirements coming up for 2030. We will suddenly have to retire those RECs. That means we will no longer sell them. When we retire the RECs, then we can claim that we are actually generating renewable energy. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds exactly right. And let's think about why that's a good thing, right? Like the RECs, when generation assets, every generation renewable energy asset is entitled to RECs for every unit of energy they generate. And as you said, utilities are now being required to, source a certain percentage of their electricity from renewables through the purchasing of RECs. So that money that is being spent on RECs ultimately goes back to the developers, to the generators, and can be used to then finance more renewable energy. So it's a way to give renewables an incentive to reward them for the clean energy that they produce. And what the change that we're looking to see in the system is that right now, if you think about that incentive, that price signal, the way it works is it's sending a flat price signal that is independent of the time of day. So it's independent of the actual fluctuations in supply and demand of electricity, right? And what we want actually to be an effective price signal is for the price to reflect supply and demand. It's kind of basic economics, right? So we want renewable energy to be cheap when it's in oversupply and more expensive when it's in undersupply. And that's not the case with the current REC system. Right. But if you move the REC system to a more granular or hourly system, then suddenly you'll see these price differentials, and that creates an opportunity, an incentive, not only for more renewables, but also for other technologies that we're going to need in order to accelerate the energy transition. And I'm talking about energy storage and things like demand response and flexibility, right? Batteries will be able to store these certificates when they're in oversupply and put them back on the market at a later time when there's a shortage. And this is an incentive to build more battery storage infrastructure, for instance, as well as more renewables. And so your target of 50% by 2030 is based on annual matching. And there are, in fact, quite a lot of utilities that have been set targets or set themselves targets to get to 100% renewable by 2030 or 2040. But again, based on annual matching of supply and demand. And that means the problem with that is they might still be using a lot of fossil fuel electricity at times when there isn't much renewables available. And other times they'll be buying excess renewables from wind and solar. So they won't really be, is kind of giving a misleading impression that they kind of eliminated their reliance on fossil fuels at that point, which won't necessarily be the case until they start to set that
so here in the U.S.,
matching. targets.
So here in the U.S., we're kind of on the annular renewable energy credit system, but the value of those RECs goes up and down, and that basically is now representing kind of the average price over a year. But if we then look at a granular mechanism, does that mean that the price of those RECs, the value that REC would command, will change every hour and would probably tend to follow the wholesale energy market to some extent?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, yes, the price of RECs today does fluctuate, but not on the basis of intraday variations in supply and demand. It varies based on other factors. The whether or not we're coming to the end of a compliance period and there's like a dash to buy RECs before the end of the month when people need to submit their reports. It's that kind of thing that drives fluctuations in the price of RECs today, or how many customers are looking to buy RECs at any one point in time. It's what we want is for these RECs to behave a bit more like how the power market behaves, exactly as you said. But right now, and so it will become an additional revenue stream to any technology that can deliver clean energy in the hours when it's most needed. And in the power market today, because there's no distinction between brown power or green power, a gas turbine has the same opportunity to make money in the power market as does a battery, right? A large utility scale battery. And that's what we want to kind of rectify, is we want to see a premium paid for technologies that deliver clean energy. And by changing this mechanism, consumers can play a big role, right? And there were billions of dollars spent on RECs last year and sending a largely ineffective price signal to the market. We can change that so the billions of dollars that are already spent but from consumers buying clean energy can directly fund the technologies that deliver clean energy when it's actually needed.
So we know that the electric grid desperately needs to have more clean energy resources on the peak load times, the hottest summer day, between 5 and 9 p.m. virtually every day. If you have a solar system, it puts power directly into the grid right from the inverter, and it's metered at that moment. If you have a wind turbine, it's putting power directly into the grid. But you mentioned hydrogen and batteries. Now, presumably, it would only be when the hydrogen is pushing power back into the grid, or when the batteries are pushing power back into the grid, or perhaps what you're doing is qualifying that hydrogen wherever it's used based on the energy that was used to generate that hydrogen.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more how this...
Yeah, absolutely. They're slightly different cases. So in the case of green hydrogen, what we're talking about is hydrogen can be used for lots of different things. It can be used to go back into electricity, but it can be used in industry. But what we're talking about is the subsidy that's available for the production of green hydrogen under the IRA. And so what it says is for every unit of green hydrogen that is produced by the electrolyzer, you can claim a tax credit. But you need electrolyzers use an insane amount of electricity, right? And we need to ensure that the electricity that goes into the electrolyzer is really clean. So just think of the electrolyzer like any other kind of load, but it's a load that is really where it's really important that is powered by clean energy. And just to highlight that, if you were to take natural gas, run it in a gas turbine to produce electricity, and then run the electricity through an electrolyzer to produce green hydrogen, that loop creates more carbon emissions than just turning natural gas directly into hydrogen. So this, if we started to subsidize a mass rollout of electrolyzers, and we didn't make sure we were using clean energy for those electrolyzers, then it would actually push up carbon emissions instead of reducing them, right? So there's a special case where we need to have a very tight definition of what is clean electricity, and that, as the US Treasury have proposed, will require hourly matching. So that's just about electricity consumption. With that, in the case of batteries, that's a separate case where in the future that we see in our vision, and it will take a few years to kind of come to fruition. But if you think about a battery, what it's doing when it's charging, it's consuming electricity, so you can treat it as a consumer. So the battery needs to buy hourly RECs and retire them against its consumption. So you can show that the battery has consumed clean energy. And when the battery is discharging, it gets to reissue new clean energy certificates, which can then be bought by another end customer, for instance, an electrolyzer, and to demonstrate that their energy has actually come from clean energy sources around the clock. And what we're saying is in those hours when there's lots of renewable energy, batteries can basically buy these certificates because they'll be cheap, store the energy, store the certificate, and put them back on the market at a time when there isn't enough. And so to displace some of the fossil fuel backup generation that would be running at that time. So that's how we see batteries starting to play a role in renewable energy credits.
So we've seen some electrolyzer projects saying, well, we're going to put our electrolyzer right next to this nuclear power plant, and we have a power purchase agreement for buying nuclear power.
Yep.
But that basically doesn't cut it, because, obviously if they're just consuming power on the grid, they're possibly requiring fossil fuels to generate someplace else, depending on the time of day.
Yeah.
The electrolyzer wants to run 24/7, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, the nice thing about nuclear is you have a lot of baseload clean energy, right? That does produce 24/7. Electrolyzers also run pretty much baseload. So there is, under the US Treasury's proposal, the electrolyzer could sign a contract with the nuclear facility. They would need to buy the RECs, and they would, they can't just have a power purchase agreement. They need to buy the EACs to verify that the energy is clean, and that could be used to then do hourly matching between the nuclear facility and the generator, and that would technically work. But obviously, not everyone can do that, right? You're limited by the availability of clean energy in all of those hours. And so the more people that demand clean energy, the more the price goes up for clean energy in the hours when there's a shortfall. And that whole process creates a demand signal.
So that means that nuclear energy, hydropower, all right, possibly geothermal power, these are all generating renewable energy credits. But sometimes there's a consideration that some of these legacy systems that were put in before the REC system even happened, I think we downgrade them to kind of a different class of RECs. We have class 1 RECs for modern stuff and class 2 RECs for legacy stuff.
Totally. Yeah, and there's a very active and valid debate about what type of assets should be used in the hydrogen, and I should have said this up front. In the hydrogen case, there's what are called the 3-pillar requirements. So it's not just about time matching. You also have to demonstrate deliverability. So the generation asset needs to be on the same grid. So there needs to be like a physical way that the electricity could travel from the generation asset to the electrolyzer. And the third pillar is called additionality. And additionality comes from making sure that the power plant was built within 3 years of the electrolyzer. So you couldn't use a 20-year-old facility for this. in the case of hydrogen, you have to use a new facility in order to source your electricity, and that's because we're subsidizing a massive increase in load. So we don't want to then, or we want to make absolutely sure that it's not creating a corresponding increase in fossil fuel demand. There's a lot of debate about other types of load, additionality, how much of a how far back should you go? There's another international standard for clean energy procurement called RE100. I don't know if you've heard of RE100, but many large businesses are signed up to this protocol, and they have a different rule around this, and they say the power plants should be less than 15 years. So you can't use a really legacy 40-year-old hydro facility. And I think that's actually for I think electrolyzers are a little special because we're subsidizing them to such a degree. But for the average consumer, I think cutting it off after 15 years kind of makes sense, because what you want for a developer wants to see a 15-year revenue stream into the future. So for a new developer, they actually do want there to be a line of sight to 15 years worth of revenues, because that will help them get funding. So it's very difficult to define this term additionality, but I think that's what you're getting at, and you see different.
To add yet another complication in here, how do we deal with natural gas power plants that have carbon capture and storage, and they capture, say, 90% of the CO2, 10% still is going out? Do they get 90% of a REC for that, or do they get RECs at all?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thankfully, it's not one that we have to define as a company. There's often regulatory bodies and standards bodies that define these types of things, these different technologies, and whether or not they qualify as clean energy. And it really does depend on the type of use that you're talking about. It's interesting that some companies have targets around renewable energy, but other companies like Google and Microsoft have their targets are based on what they call carbon free. So it's a little bit broader than just renewable energy and would include nuclear. I think you need to go down into, the weeds of any particular technology. Biomass, for instance, is quite controversial, but is classed as renewable in Europe in general. But there are lots of standards around what is the source of that biomass energy, and to ensure that it's valid. You get this kind of interesting crossover with carbon capture and storage, because you can actually, if you put the carbon back into the ground, you can actually get an offset for the carbon that you've offset, the carbon removal credit, which can be sold in a different market. It's not an EAC, it's something else. But yeah, so these are often rules which are defined elsewhere in different standards depending on the use case.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we certainly see that there is a lot of financial incentives from the Investment Recovery Act, $3 a kilogram of hydrogen, so many dollars a metric ton for carbon capture, depending on the integrity there. So obviously there's a lot of rules. But as we close up, one of the things I wanted to mention is that there is actually proof that my discussion with Toby is influencing the electric market. I have a light board meeting this afternoon at 2:00, just a few hours from now. And we are going to bring up this issue of renewable energy credits and how we're doing the accounting, because I'm not sure that we always completely understand these things. So there you go, Toby, that you are actually making an influence with this, small utility here in Princeton, Massachusetts. So work.
Well, well, thanks for bringing that up, and happy to, support in whatever way we can. I think the way I like to think about this market is that, any one consumer, it's hard to individually make to understand your impact with a single purchase of a REC, right? But that you can compare this to any other type of commodity market. I actually wrote a blog on our website, if you go to granularenergy.com, which basically likens buying clean energy to like buying, I use the example of oat milk, right, from the grocery store. I know what it's like where you live, but in London, everyone seems to be buying oat milk these days instead of cow's milk, and with displacing what people used to drink with something that's different. And so if I go to the grocery store and I buy myself a carton of oat milk, I haven't really done much, right? Like, the world hasn't changed. But if 1 million people go to the grocery store and they each buy themselves some oat milk, and they keep doing that week on week, then what that does is create a demand signal that somehow results in the supply coming, right? And that's because there's a market in the middle. There's the role of aggregators of demand, the grocery store, that will sign contracts which will enable the financing and construction of new production facilities. And I haven't had to do that myself, but I played my role in making that happen. I didn't need to sign a 10-year oat milk purchase agreement, right, in order to get that thing built. What's important is I just keep going to the grocery store and buying oat milk each week. And in the analogy with clean energy, it's the utilities, the energy suppliers that can play the role of the grocery store. As long as they see that demand coming from customers, then somehow the supply will find a way to appear. Right.
Yes, our utility was actually looking at the option of providing a 100% clean energy market to sell to our residences. But obviously, if every data center, Google and Microsoft, and every chemical industry, aluminum plant suddenly started to look at their scope 2 emissions and decided that they are going to purchase the renewable energy credits for all of the power that their entity uses, now all of a sudden you have a large demand for these energy attributes and or credits, and that will drive the price up. That will encourage people to put renewable power on the grid, and so that seems like
you've got it in one.
That seems like a win-win situation. So
exactly, that's the idea. That's the idea, and I think we'll get there. And I don't want to get political, but if you look on the horizon, there's a lot of political change potentially coming in the US and Europe, which will have a great impact on the role of governments, right? On the role that governments are playing in the energy transition. And what I'm saying is that if for anyone who wants the energy transition to happen, for us to become independent from fossil fuels, then we can't guarantee that governments will do this for us. There's some risk there that governments won't do all of that work. So we need to find ways where we can have a responsibility as a consumer to, whether we're a business or an individual, to help make that change happen. So this is the role of the consumer, I think, is going to become very important, potentially much more important than it has been so far.
Thank you, Toby, for sharing your insights and stories with us.